The rusty key turned in the lock of the abandoned mountain house, with a sound like breaking bones. Esla Martinez stepped inside, her 6-month belly pressing against the doorframe as she surveyed what should have been her inheritance. Rotting floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and the musty smell of decades of neglect. Her grandmother Rosa had died penniless, or so everyone believed. But when Esla accidentally kicked through a loose floorboard in the kitchen, everything changed. Beneath the house lay a hidden vault filled with gold coins, rare jewels, and documents that revealed her grandmother's impossible secret identity. Rosa hadn't been a poor mountain woman. She'd been protecting a fortune stolen from dangerous people who thought she'd taken it to her grave. Now those same people were coming. The black SUVs had already been spotted winding up the mountain road. Esla clutched her belly, feeling her baby kick as if sensing the danger. She had hours, maybe less, before they arrived. The question wasn't whether she could escape with the treasure, it was whether she could survive, long enough to protect her unborn child. But what if her grandmother had left more than just gold behind? What if she'd left the key to fighting back? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The manila envelope tucked beneath the gold bars bore Esla's name in her grandmother's spidery handwriting. Inside, yellowed photographs showed Rosa as a young woman in expensive clothes, standing beside men in tailored suits who looked nothing like the mountain folk Esla remembered from childhood visits. One document made her breath catch, a birth certificate for Rosa Delacroix, not Rosa Martinez as she'd always known her. Delacroix. The name meant something, tugged at a memory from old news stories her journalism professor had shown years ago. Something about a missing fortune from the 1970s, a scandal involving arms dealers and dirty money that had disappeared into thin air. Esla's phone buzzed. A text from her neighbor down the mountain. Strange cars asking questions about you. Said you're in danger. Get out now. Her hands trembled as she rifled through more documents. Bank account numbers in 3 different countries, safe deposit box keys, and a letter addressed to her, dated just 3 months ago, shortly before Rosa's sudden death from what doctors called a stroke. Mi querida Esla, the letter began. If you are reading this, they have found me. I pray you and your baby are safe, but I know they will come for what I have protected all these years. The money belongs to families destroyed by evil men who dealt in death. I took it to return it someday, but I ran out of time. The baby kicked hard against Esla's ribs as she continued reading. Outside, mountain wind rattled the windows, and every sound made her jump. How long did she have? The winding road up the mountain took 20 minutes to navigate, longer in the dark. There is more, Rosa's letter continued. Behind the loose stone in the fireplace, you will find what you need to disappear forever. Or, if you are brave like I was once, what you need to finish what I started. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. They show no mercy, even for pregnant women. Esla dropped the letter and stumbled to the fireplace, her pregnancy making every movement awkward and urgent. The 4th stone from the left wiggled when she pressed it. Behind it lay a small metal box containing a passport with her photo but a different name, Sofia Hernandez, and enough cash to start a new life anywhere in the world. But there was something else. A thumb drive wrapped in plastic, with another note. Everything you need to destroy them. Give this to Agent Morrison at the FBI field office in Denver. Tell him Rosa sends her regards. Car engines rumbled in the distance, still far down the mountain but getting closer. Esla's mind raced. She could take the passport and money, disappear into another life with her unborn child. Or she could trust a dead grandmother she'd apparently never really known and try to finish a fight that had been going on since before she was born. The baby kicked again, more gently this time, as if offering comfort. Esla pressed her hand to her belly and made her choice. She grabbed the most valuable jewels that would fit in her pockets, the thumb drive and the passport. The rest of the gold would have to stay, too heavy, too obvious. But she wasn't running to hide. Rosa had spent 40 years hiding in these mountains, protecting stolen money that belonged to victims of violent men. If those same men thought they could threaten her unborn child to get it back, they were about to learn that Rosa Delacroix had raised her granddaughter better than that. The headlights were visible through the trees now. Esla slipped out the back door into the darkness, one hand protecting her belly and the other clutching the thumb drive that would either save her or get them both killed. The mountain road twisted like a broken spine, each pothole sending fresh jolts through Esla's already aching back. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her wedding ring catching the late afternoon sun that filtered through the windshield. 6 months pregnant and driving alone to claim a house she'd never seen. Marcus would have called her insane if he were still alive to voice an opinion. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving her with nothing but her grandmother's hand-drawn map and increasingly sparse road signs. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their shadows growing longer as the sun dipped toward the peaks ahead. Esla had forgotten how quiet mountains could be, how the silence seemed to press against her eardrums until even her heartbeat felt thunderous. When the house finally appeared around a sharp bend, she had to brake hard to avoid overshooting the narrow driveway. The building crouched against the mountainside like something trying to hide, its weathered cedar shakes dark with age and neglect. 2 stories of sagging roof lines and broken shutters, with a wraparound porch that listed dangerously to one side. Grandmother Vera's final gift looked more like a demolition project than an inheritance. Esla killed the engine and sat in the sudden quiet, one hand resting on her belly where the baby had been unusually active during the drive. Maybe he could sense her anxiety, or maybe he was protesting this whole ridiculous venture, just as Marcus would have done. "What do you think, little one?" she murmured. "Should we turn around and pretend we never got the lawyer's letter?" But running away wouldn't solve anything. The medical bills from Marcus's final months had gutted their savings, and her job at the library barely covered rent on their tiny apartment. She needed whatever money this place might bring, even if it meant spending her maternity leave elbow-deep in renovations and real estate paperwork. The porch steps groaned ominously under her weight, and she made a mental note to add structural repairs to what was already promising to be an endless list. The key turned easily in the lock, too easily, as if the mechanism had been used recently. Strange, since Grandmother Vera had been dead for 3 months, and the lawyer had assured her that no one else had access to the property. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of light from windows so grimy they filtered the world into sepia tones. The air smelled of wood rot and something else, something sharp and medicinal that made her nose wrinkle. She'd expected the mustiness of an abandoned house, but this scent felt deliberately applied, like disinfectant or cleaning chemicals. The main floor held no surprises, a living room dominated by a stone fireplace, a kitchen with appliances that belonged in a museum, and a dining room where sheets covered furniture in ghostly humps. Everything looked exactly as old and neglected as she'd anticipated, except for the floors. The wide plank hardwood was scuffed and worn, but cleaner than it should have been. Someone had swept recently and swept thoroughly. Esla found herself moving more quietly as she explored, though she couldn't say why. The baby's movements had settled into an uneasy flutter, and she pressed her hand against her side in what was becoming an automatic gesture of comfort for both of them. The staircase to the second floor was solid despite its age, and she climbed carefully, one hand on the banister and the other trailing along the wall. Family photographs lined the narrow hallway at the top, most of them faces she didn't recognize. Grandmother Vera had been her father's mother, and after he died when Esla was 12, contact had dwindled to Christmas cards and birthday checks that stopped coming sometime during college. The master bedroom overlooked the valley below, and from its windows she could see her car looking small and vulnerable in the fading light. She'd have to drive back down the mountain soon, or risk navigating those curves in the dark. But something kept her moving through the rooms, checking closets and peering into corners as if she might find answers to questions she hadn't thought to ask. In what must have been Vera's sewing room, she found the first real clue that someone else had been here. A cardboard box sat on the cutting table, its contents scattered as if someone had searched through them quickly. Old patterns and fabric scraps. Nothing that seemed valuable, but the haphazard arrangement felt wrong, deliberate. The baby gave a sharp kick, and Esla winced, suddenly aware of how isolated she was up here. No cell signal, no neighbors visible through the trees, and a growing certainty that she wasn't the first person to walk these rooms since Grandmother Vera's death. Someone had been looking for something, and they'd been looking recently. As the shadows deepened around the old house, Esla realized her simple inheritance had just become considerably more complicated. The floorboard creaked ominously as Esla shifted her weight, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. She held her breath, listening for any sound that might indicate the wood was about to give way entirely. When nothing happened, she carefully lifted the loose board, revealing a dark cavity beneath. Her phone's flashlight illuminated something that made her heart skip. A metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, sat nestled between the floor joists. The surface was tarnished but intact, and when she lifted it, the weight surprised her. Whatever was inside was substantial. Esla carried the box to the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she examined the simple latch. No lock, just a mechanism that had probably kept the contents safe for decades. She took a deep breath and opened it. The first thing she saw were photographs. Black and white images of people she didn't recognize, standing in front of buildings that looked European. The clothing suggested the 1940s, maybe earlier. Beneath the photos lay documents in what appeared to be German official-looking papers with stamps and signatures. But it was what lay at the bottom that made her gasp. Jewelry, lots of it. Necklaces, rings, brooches, all appearing to be genuine and valuable. Some pieces were clearly antique, with intricate settings and stones that caught the kitchen light like captured fire. She lifted a particularly ornate necklace, feeling the weight of what had to be real gold and diamonds. Her grandmother had been poor. Esla remembered visiting as a child, seeing the patched clothes, the simple meals, the careful way grandmother counted every dollar. Yet here was a fortune hidden beneath her floorboards. A piece of paper fluttered from between the jewelry. Esla unfolded it to find her grandmother's handwriting, shaky but legible, "For my family, when the time is right. What was stolen must be returned to its rightful owners. Trust no one else with this burden. M.K." The initials confused her. Her grandmother's name was Maria Kovac, not M.K., unless she'd changed her name at some point, which wasn't uncommon for immigrants of her generation. Esla photographed everything with her phone before carefully replacing the items in the box. Her mind raced with questions. Where had these things come from? Why had her grandmother hidden them? And what did she mean about returning them to rightful owners? The baby kicked, reminding her that she wasn't just making decisions for herself anymore. Whatever this was, it was now her responsibility. She was so absorbed in studying the documents that she almost missed the sound of a car approaching on the mountain road. Almost. Living alone had made her hyper-aware of every noise, and vehicles were rare up here. Esla quickly closed the box and looked around frantically for a hiding place. The floorboard was too obvious now. She settled on the pantry, pushing the box behind old canning jars on the highest shelf she could reach. A knock at the front door made her jump. She checked her appearance in the hallway mirror, trying to look casual despite her racing heart. Through the peephole, she saw a man in his 50s, well-dressed in a way that seemed out of place on the mountain. He wore an expensive-looking coat and polished shoes that had probably never touched dirt before today. "Miss Novak?" His accent was slight but noticeable, Eastern European maybe. "My name is Viktor Kozlov. I was a friend of your grandmother's. I heard about her passing and wanted to pay my respects." Esla opened the door but kept the chain latched. "I'm sorry, I don't remember her mentioning you." His smile was practiced, professional. "We knew each other many years ago before you were born. I was in the area and thought I might visit the old place for sentimental reasons. Perhaps you would allow me to come in. I have some stories about Maria that you might enjoy hearing." Everything about this felt wrong. Her grandmother had been isolated up here, rarely mentioning friends or visitors. And his timing, coming just days after she'd found the box, seemed too coincidental. "I'm sorry, but this isn't a good time," she said. "I'm not feeling well." His expression shifted slightly, the friendly mask slipping. "Of course. Perhaps another time. I'm staying in town for a few days." He handed her a business card through the gap. "Please, call me if you change your mind. There are things about your grandmother's past that you might find enlightening." After she closed and locked the door, Esla watched through the window as he stood on her porch for a long moment, looking at the house with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He wasn't just paying respects, he was studying the place. When his car finally disappeared down the mountain road, she retrieved the box from the pantry and stared at it. Whatever her grandmother had hidden, other people knew about it, and now they knew that she knew. The isolation that had seemed peaceful yesterday suddenly felt dangerous. The morning air bit at Esla's cheeks as she stood in the overgrown garden behind her grandmother's house, cell phone pressed to her ear. Marcus's voice crackled through the poor mountain reception. "You're being paranoid, Ez. It was probably just some local kid looking for a place to party or shoot up." She kicked at a rusted garden tool half buried in weeds. "Local kids don't wear expensive hiking boots, Marcus. I saw the tread marks in the mud by the back door." "How do you even know they were expensive?" "'Cause I spent 3 years working at that outdoor gear shop, remember? These weren't cheap knockoffs." She paused, watching a hawk circle overhead. Someone was looking for something specific. The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Marcus sighed. "Look, maybe you should just come home, sell the place as is and be done with it. You're 7 months pregnant, for God's sake." Esla's free hand moved instinctively to her belly. The baby had been restless all night, as if picking up on her anxiety. "I can't just abandon this, Marcus. It's all I have left of her. It's a falling-down house in the middle of nowhere. Your grandmother wouldn't want you risking your safety for a pile of rotting wood." But that wasn't entirely true, was it? Esla thought about the letter Nana had left with the will, written in her careful cursive. "There are secrets in that house, little bird. Secrets worth keeping safe." At the time, she'd assumed her grandmother meant family photographs or old recipes. Now she wondered if there was something more literal hidden in those crumbling walls. After ending the call, she spent the morning exploring the house more methodically. The front parlor revealed nothing but mouse droppings and water damage. The kitchen held only the ghosts of family meals and her grandmother's ancient cast-iron cookware. But in the small study off the main hallway, she noticed something odd. The room felt smaller than it should have, given the size of the house from the outside. She paced off the dimensions, then walked around to the exterior wall. There was definitely space unaccounted for, maybe 4 feet of depth that didn't exist inside the study. Back indoors, she examined the walls more carefully. The paneling looked original to the house, dark wood that had been lovingly maintained despite the decay elsewhere. But one section, behind where her grandmother's old secretary desk had stood, seemed different. The wood grain didn't quite match, and when she pressed against it, it felt less solid than the surrounding panels. Her fingers traced the edges until she found a small depression in the wood, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. She pressed and heard a soft click. The panel swung inward on silent hinges. Esla's breath caught. The space beyond was narrow but deep, more of a large closet than a room. Dusty afternoon light filtered through a small, grimy window she hadn't noticed from outside. But it wasn't the hidden room itself that made her heart race. It was what filled it. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked 3 high in some places. They looked military in origin, with stenciled numbers and shipping marks that had faded with age. Some were open, revealing carefully wrapped bundles nestled in straw packing. Even in the dim light, she could see the glint of metal and precious stones. She unwrapped one bundle with trembling fingers. It was a silver chalice, ornately decorated and clearly ancient. Another held what looked like a small painting on wood, the kind she'd seen in art history books depicting medieval religious scenes. A third contained jewelry, not costume pieces, but real gold and gems that caught the light like captured fire. The sheer volume was overwhelming. There had to be dozens of pieces, maybe hundreds. Each one looked priceless. Esla sank into the single chair positioned in the center of the room, her grandmother's old reading chair from the parlor. Nana had known this was here, had sat in this very spot, surrounded by a fortune in stolen. The word hit her like a physical blow. These weren't family heirlooms. This was a cache of stolen art and artifacts, hidden away like some kind of dragon's hoard. But stolen from where and when? Some of the pieces looked old enough to predate her grandmother's birth. A sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps on gravel, deliberate and careful. She eased out of the chair and crept to the small window. A black SUV was parked at the end of the overgrown driveway, and two figures in dark clothing were approaching the house. They moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that made her stomach drop. These weren't curious neighbors or lost hikers. These were the people who had been here before, and they'd come back. Esla quietly pulled the hidden panel closed and hurried toward the back of the house, her mind racing. Whatever her grandmother had gotten involved in, it was far from over. The storm had passed by morning, but Esla couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the house. She'd barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan the old structure made as it settled. Now, standing in the kitchen with weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows, she tried to convince herself it had all been pregnancy hormones and imagination. The coffee maker sputtered to life, one of the few appliances that still worked, and she wrapped her hands around the warm mug, inhaling the familiar aroma. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Marcus, but she wasn't ready to explain why she'd driven 4 hours into the mountains without telling him. How could she explain what she didn't understand herself? The manila envelope sat on the kitchen table where she'd left it, its contents spread across the scarred wood surface. In daylight, the document seemed less ominous but no less mysterious. Bank statements showing deposits that made no sense, property deeds for land she'd never heard of, and that photograph, her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a man whose face had been carefully cut away. Esla picked up one of the bank statements, squinting at the faded ink. The deposits weren't regular, but they were substantial, thousands of dollars appearing sporadically over decades, always accompanied by the same cryptic notation, consultation services rendered. Her grandmother had been a seamstress, taking in alterations and mending for the townspeople. These amounts suggested something far more lucrative. A knock at the front door made her freeze, coffee mug halfway to her lips. Through the kitchen window, she could see a dark sedan parked in the overgrown driveway. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crept toward the front room, staying low beneath the windows. "Mrs. Carver?" A man's voice, polite but persistent. "My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney. I believe we have some matters to discuss regarding your inheritance." Esla pressed herself against the wall beside the door. She hadn't told anyone she was coming here except Marcus, and she'd specifically avoided contacting the local authorities or any legal representatives. How did this man know she was here? "I know you're inside, Mrs. Carver. Your car is in the driveway." The voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because your grandmother asked me to contact you if anything ever happened to her." Against her better judgment, Esla found herself reaching for the door handle. She stopped, hand trembling slightly. "Do you have identification?" "Of course." She heard papers rustling. "I'm going to slide my business card and driver's license under the door." A moment later, 2 cards appeared on the hardwood floor. Esla picked them up with shaking fingers. David Chen, attorney at law, with an address in the valley town of Cedar Falls. The license photo matched. An Asian man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She opened the door but kept the chain latched, peering through the gap. The man matched his photo exactly, dressed in a conservative grey suit despite the mountain setting. He held a leather briefcase and offered a patient smile. "Thank you," he said. "I know this must be confusing. My grandmother never mentioned an attorney. Ruth was a very private woman. She kept many secrets, as I'm sure you're beginning to discover." His eyes flicked toward the kitchen where the documents were still scattered across the table. "May I come in? What I have to tell you isn't suitable for discussion on a front porch." Esla hesitated, then unlatched the chain. Her grandmother had kept secrets. The envelope proved that much. Maybe this man had answers. Chen entered slowly, respectfully, wiping his feet on the threadbare mat. His gaze swept the room, taking in the dust sheets and faded wallpaper with what looked like genuine sadness. "She loved this place," he said quietly, "even after everything that happened." "What happened?" Chen set his briefcase on the coffee table and clicked it open. Inside were more documents, these ones crisp and new. "Your grandmother witnessed something, Mrs. Carver, something that certain people would have killed to keep secret. Instead of going to the authorities, she chose a different path, a more profitable one." Esla's mouth went dry. "Are you saying she was blackmailing someone?" "I'm saying she was ensuring her family's future." Chen pulled out a thick folder. For 40 years, Ruth collected insurance payments, safety money. The arrangement was supposed to end with her death, but she made a crucial error. "What kind of error?" Chen's expression grew grave. "She kept records, detailed records, and now those records belong to you." He gestured toward the kitchen. "I assume you've found some of them already." Esla sank into her grandmother's rocking chair, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Someone was watching the house last night." "Yes," Chen said simply. "They were, and they'll be back. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Esla's hands trembled as she stared at the photographs scattered across the kitchen table. The faces looking back at her were strangers, yet the house around them was unmistakably familiar. The same stone fireplace, the same wooden beams, even the same view through the windows. But these people wore clothes from decades past, their poses formal and stiff in the way of old portraits. She picked up one photograph that made her breath catch. A young woman with dark hair and sharp cheekbones stood beside a tall man in a military uniform. The woman's resemblance to Esla's grandmother was striking, though this had to be someone from an earlier generation. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Margaret and Heinrich, 1943. Heinrich. The name sent a chill down her spine. She'd heard whispers of that name in her grandmother's confused ramblings during those final months in the nursing home. Margaret had spoken of Heinrich with a mixture of fear and sadness that Esla had attributed to dementia-induced fantasies. The baby kicked sharply, as if sensing her distress. Esla rubbed her belly absently, her mind racing. She set the photograph down and reached for another, this one showing the same couple with several other people standing in front of what looked like a train car loaded with wooden crates. A sudden creak from the floor above made her freeze. The house settled constantly. She'd learned that much in her few days here, but this sound was different, deliberate, like footsteps. She held her breath, listening. Another creak, then another. Someone was definitely walking around upstairs. Esla's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed her phone from the counter, but the screen showed no signal bars. The mountain's spotty coverage had been a constant frustration. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and her car was parked outside where anyone could see it. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, right above where she sat. Moving as quietly as possible, Esla slipped off her shoes and crept toward the kitchen doorway. The old house's layout worked in her favor. She could reach the back door without crossing under the area where the intruder was standing. But first, she needed to grab the metal box and its contents. Whatever was happening, those documents had triggered it. She tiptoed back to the table and carefully gathered the photographs and papers. Stuffing them into the box with hands that shook so badly, she nearly dropped everything. The footsteps resumed, moving toward what she thought was the staircase. Panic shot through her. If they came downstairs, she'd be trapped. Clutching the box against her chest, Esla moved toward the back door. The floorboard under her left foot groaned loudly, and she froze. The footsteps above stopped too, and in the silence that followed, she could hear her own ragged breathing. Then came the sound that made her blood turn to ice, the deliberate, measured cadence of someone descending the stairs. She abandoned stealth and ran for the back door, fumbling with the old deadbolt. Her pregnant body felt clumsy and slow, the metal box awkward in her arms. The lock finally gave way, and she stumbled outside into the crisp mountain air. Behind her, she heard the footsteps reach the main floor. The forest began just 20 yards from the house, thick pines that could provide cover if she could reach them. But running wasn't really an option. Not in her condition, not carrying the box, not when she didn't know these mountain trails well enough to navigate them safely. Instead, she veered toward the old root cellar she'd noticed during her first exploration of the property. The wooden doors were nearly hidden beneath overgrown vines, set into the hillside like the entrance to a hobbit hole. She pulled them open and slipped inside, leaving them cracked just enough to see out. The cellar smelled of earth and old potatoes, and spider webs brushed against her face in the darkness. She pressed herself against the far wall, holding the metal box tight against her body, and waited. Minutes passed like hours. Then she saw a figure emerge from the back door of the house, a tall man in dark clothing moving with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence. He stood for a moment, scanning the area methodically. Even from a distance, Esla could see he was holding something in his hand, a gun. The man walked to the tree line, pausing to examine something on the ground, probably her footprints in the soft earth. Her heart sank as she realized he could track her if he knew what to look for. But instead of following her trail, he turned and walked around the side of the house, disappearing from view. Esla waited, counting her heartbeats, feeling the baby's restless movements inside her. Whatever was in that box, people were willing to break into houses and carry weapons to get it. And now she was caught in the middle of something that had begun long before she was born, something connected to Heinrich and Margaret, and whatever secrets her grandmother had carried to her grave. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, just as Esla finished photographing the last page of her grandmother's journal. Rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury, and somewhere in the house a shutter began banging with metronomic persistence. She set down her phone and rubbed her eyes, trying to process everything she'd read. The journal entries painted a picture of a woman living in constant fear. Her grandmother had written about watchers in the woods and men who asked too many questions in town. Most disturbing were the references to something called Henrik's Legacy, apparently a collection of rare artifacts and documents that her great-grandfather had smuggled out of Norway during the war. Esla's hand moved instinctively to her belly as the baby gave a particularly strong kick. The child seemed more active tonight, as if sensing her mother's agitation. She needed to call Marcus, needed to tell him about the journal and the coins, but every time she reached for her phone, something held her back. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Trust no one completely. Even those we love can be turned. A sudden crash from upstairs made her freeze. The sound was too deliberate, too heavy to be explained by the storm. Esla grabbed the flashlight she'd started keeping on the kitchen table and slowly made her way toward the stairs. The old house groaned around her, settling deeper into its foundation with each gust of wind. Halfway up the stairs, she heard it again, a scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the master bedroom, the room where she'd found the loose floorboard. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the remaining steps, the flashlight beam dancing ahead of her. The bedroom door stood open, exactly as she'd left it, but the rug had been pulled back, and the floorboard she'd pried up was now completely removed, lying askew beside the gaping hole. Someone had been here. Someone was possibly still here. Esla backed toward the stairs, her free hand pressed against her stomach. She needed to get out of the house, needed to drive to town and call the police. But as she turned, a floorboard creaked behind her, and she knew with terrible certainty that she wasn't alone. "Don't turn around." The voice was male, quiet, almost gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I need you to listen very carefully." Esla's throat constricted. "What do you want?" "The same thing your grandmother wanted, to keep you safe." There was a pause, filled only by the storm's fury. "My name is Eric Lindquist. Your great-grandfather was my great-uncle." Despite his warning, Esla couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. The man standing in the doorway was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He held his hands visible at his sides, palms open, but there was something in his posture that suggested he could move very quickly if necessary. "That's impossible," she said. "My grandmother never mentioned—" "There's a lot your grandmother never mentioned. She was protecting you." Eric took a careful step closer. Henrik didn't just smuggle artifacts out of Norway, Esla. He smuggled information, documents that certain people would kill for, even today. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Esla winced. Eric's expression softened with concern. "You should sit down. This conversation is going to take a while." He gestured toward the bedroom. "And we need to put that floorboard back before anyone else comes looking." "Anyone else?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "The coins you found, they're not the real treasure. They're markers, meant to lead to something much more valuable and much more dangerous." Eric moved past her into the bedroom, kneeling beside the hole in the floor. "Your grandmother knew this day would come. She left instructions." Esla watched him work, replacing the floorboard with practiced efficiency. "What kind of instructions?" "The kind that might keep you and your baby alive." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "But first, you need to understand what you're really dealing with. Your great-grandfather didn't just document Nazi war crimes. He documented the network of people who helped them disappear after the war. Some of those people are still alive. Some of their children have inherited their secrets." The storm seemed to intensify around them, as if the house itself was reacting to his words. Esla sank into the chair by the window, her mind reeling. "The man who's been asking questions about you in town," Eric continued. "Marcus didn't tell you about him, did he? That's because Marcus doesn't know who to trust either. None of us do." Outside, lightning illuminated the forest, and for just a moment, Esla thought she saw figures moving between the trees. Then darkness swallowed them again, leaving only the sound of rain and her own ragged breathing. The first thing Esla noticed when she woke was the silence. Not the peaceful mountain quiet she'd grown accustomed to, but something deeper, more oppressive. Even the usual morning bird song seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She'd slept fitfully, Marcus's journal clutched against her chest like a talisman. The leather binding had left an impression on her palm, and the weight of its secrets felt heavier in daylight. Rolling carefully out of bed, she placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the subtle flutter that had become her morning greeting from the baby. Downstairs, coffee brewing, she spread the journal open on the kitchen table alongside the crude map she'd sketched the night before. The X marked a spot roughly 50 yards northeast of the house, near what appeared to be a cluster of large boulders she remembered seeing during her initial property walk. Marcus had been clever, close enough to monitor, far enough to avoid accidental discovery. The sound of gravel crunching in her driveway made her freeze. Through the kitchen window, she watched a black sedan navigate the winding path toward her house. Not the same car from yesterday, but similar enough to send ice through her veins. She quickly closed the journal and slipped it into the kitchen drawer beneath old dish towels. 2 men emerged from the vehicle. The driver was older, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit that looked absurdly formal against the mountain backdrop. His companion was younger, broader, with the kind of alert posture that suggested military training. Neither looked like they were here for a social visit. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house. Esla considered not answering, but the sedan blocked her driveway, and there was nowhere to run that wouldn't risk the baby. Taking a steadying breath, she opened the door but kept the chain latch engaged. "Miss Morrison?" The older man's smile was practiced, professional. "I'm David Ashford from Ashford Antiquities. I understand you've inherited some potentially valuable items from your grandmother." I'm not selling anything." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Of course, of course. But perhaps we could discuss an appraisal. Your grandmother had quite the reputation as a collector. Certain pieces might be worth far more than you realize." The younger man's eyes weren't on her face, but scanning what he could see of the house's interior over her shoulder. "We'd be happy to make the process worth your while," he added, his tone carrying an undercurrent that made her skin crawl. "My grandmother didn't collect antiques," Esla lied smoothly. "Just old furniture and family photos. Nothing valuable." Ashford's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. "Perhaps we could come in, have a look around? Sometimes treasures hide in the most unexpected places." "I'm sorry, but this isn't a good time. I'm renovating, and the house is in shambles." She started to close the door, but the younger man stepped forward, his foot blocking the frame. "Miss Morrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not really asking." The baby kicked, sharp and sudden, as if responding to her spike of adrenaline. Esla's hand moved protectively to her belly, and she saw both men notice the gesture. Great. Now they knew about the pregnancy too. "Actually, gentlemen, I think you're the ones who misunderstood." The new voice came from behind them. Esla looked past her unwelcome visitors to see Tom walking up the driveway, a steaming coffee cup in one hand and what looked like a sheriff's department radio clipped to his belt. "Tom," she breathed, relief flooding through her. "Morning, Esla. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp as they assessed the two men. "I was just heading back to town and thought I'd check if you needed anything picked up." Ashford's professional mask slipped slightly. "We were just discussing some family heirlooms with Miss Morrison. Private business." "Funny thing about private business up here," Tom replied, stepping closer. "It tends to be pretty public. Small community, you know. Everyone looks out for everyone else." He nodded toward the radio. "Sheriff's on duty today if you need any assistance with antique appraisals." The standoff lasted several heartbeats. Then Ashford stepped back, his smile returning but colder now. "Of course. Miss Morrison, please consider our offer. We'll be in touch." The younger man's foot retreated from her doorframe. "Soon," he added quietly. Esla watched them climb into the sedan and reverse down her driveway with more speed than the narrow path warranted. Only when their taillights disappeared did she realize she'd been holding her breath. "Friends of yours?" Tom asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Something like that." She opened the door wider. "Want some real coffee? I think we need to talk." As Tom stepped inside, Esla caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line beyond her property, a flash of light that might have been binoculars catching the morning sun. They weren't gone. They were just watching now. The basement felt different in the harsh fluorescent light Marcus had rigged up. What had seemed mysterious and enchanting just hours before now appeared stark and clinical. Esla descended the creaking stairs, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall, the other protective over her belly. The baby had been unusually active since she'd discovered the cache, as if sensing her elevated stress. Marcus was already down there, photographing everything with methodical precision. The metallic click of his camera echoed off the walls as he documented each angle of the hidden compartment. "We need a complete record before we move anything else," he said without looking up. "If those people come back, we'll need proof of what was here originally." Esla knelt beside the opening, her fingers tracing the edges where the stone had been so carefully fitted. "My grandmother lived here for 40 years. How did she never find this?" "Maybe she did." Marcus lowered his camera. "Think about it, Esla. Why would she leave you this place? She barely knew you, right? Your family wasn't close to her." The observation stung because it was true. Grandmother Vera had been a distant figure in Esla's childhood, present only at major holidays and even then, quietly observing from the periphery. Esla's mother had always spoken of her with a mixture of respect and frustration, calling her too independent for her own good and stubborn as the mountain itself. "She used to tell strange stories," Esla murmured, the memory surfacing unbidden. "When I was maybe 7 or 8, she said the mountain had secrets, and that someday someone in our family would need to know them. My mother would get so annoyed, said she was filling my head with nonsense. Marcus had gone still. What kind of stories? About hidden things, treasures that weren't treasures. She said the mountain remembered everything, even what people wanted to forget. Esla laughed shakily. I thought she meant like fairy tales, you know, hidden kingdoms and magic caves. The sound of a vehicle in the distance made them both freeze. Marcus immediately switched off the fluorescent light, plunging them into darkness. They listened as the engine grew closer, then stopped somewhere near the house. Car doors slammed with deliberate quiet. Upstairs, Marcus whispered, "Now." They climbed as silently as they could, emerging into the kitchen just as footsteps crunched across the front porch. Esla's heart hammered against her ribs. Through the window she could see two figures moving around the perimeter of the house, their faces obscured by shadows and baseball caps. Marcus pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal. The mountain's spotty coverage, which had seemed like a peaceful escape from the digital world, now felt like a trap. "Back door," he mouthed. They crept through the house, avoiding the floorboards that creaked. Behind them, someone was testing the front door handle. When it didn't turn, there was a moment of silence, then the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against wood. The back door opened onto a small deck that overlooked the steep drop behind the house. There was nowhere to run except into the woods, but in her condition, Esla knew she couldn't move fast enough. The baby pressed against her lungs, making every breath feel insufficient. Marcus seemed to realize the same thing. He scanned the area desperately, then pointed toward a section of the deck where a loose board created a gap large enough for them to squeeze under. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it might buy them time. They were barely concealed when the back door opened. Footsteps moved across the deck above them, and dust filtered down through the gaps between the boards. Esla pressed her face against Marcus's shoulder to muffle her breathing. "Anything?" a voice called from inside the house. "Nothing out here. You find the basement yet?" "Yeah, back corner of the kitchen. Looks like someone's been down there recently. Fresh footprints in the dust, and there's new wiring for lights." Esla's blood turned to ice. They'd been so focused on documenting their discovery that they'd left obvious evidence of their presence. The fluorescent light Marcus had installed would be impossible to miss. "Think they found it." Something was found. There's a hole in the wall, looks deliberately opened. But if there was anything in it, it's gone now. The footsteps above them moved toward the edge of the deck, and suddenly a boot appeared inches from Esla's face. She held her breath until her lungs burned. "We need to find them," the voice said, closer now. "The girl and whoever's helping her. They can't have gone far, especially in her condition. Boss wants this cleaned up quick. No loose ends. Then we better hope they're still in the area. Mountain's got a lot of places to disappear." The footsteps retreated. Car doors slammed again, but the engine didn't start immediately. Instead, there was the sound of papers rustling, like maps being consulted. They were planning a systematic search. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made Esla's blood freeze. She pressed herself against the kitchen window, peering through a gap in the curtains as headlights swept across the overgrown driveway. The car stopped just beyond the reach of the porch light, engine idling in the darkness. Marcus appeared beside her, his face grim. "How many?" "Can't tell. The headlights are blinding." Esla's hand instinctively moved to her belly. The baby had been restless all evening, as if sensing her mounting anxiety. The engine cut off, plunging them into an oppressive silence broken only by the mountain wind rattling the old windows. Two car doors slammed in quick succession. "Back door," Marcus whispered, grabbing her hand. They crept through the house, avoiding the floorboards Esla had learned would betray them with creaks. Behind them, heavy footsteps echoed on the front porch, followed by the scrape of metal against the door lock. "They're not even trying to be subtle," Esla breathed. Marcus had already reached the kitchen's back exit, his hand on the deadbolt. He paused, listening. The sound of splintering wood came from the front of the house. "Now," he hissed. They slipped out into the frigid mountain air. Esla's breath formed ghostly clouds as they moved along the house's shadow toward the tree line. The forest that had seemed so menacing during her first days here now felt like salvation, a dark maze where they could disappear. A beam of light suddenly swept across the yard, missing them by mere feet. Esla bit back a gasp as Marcus pulled her behind the old well house. Through the crumbling stone structure's gaps, she could see two figures moving systematically around the property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like blades. One of them spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "House is empty." They cleared out fast. "Check the cellar," came the reply. A woman's voice, cold and professional. The old woman was clever. There could be hiding spots we missed. Esla's heart hammered against her ribs. These weren't random intruders or desperate treasure hunters. These people knew about her grandmother, knew about the house's secrets. They moved with military precision, and that terrified her more than any bumbling criminal would have. Marcus tugged her sleeve, pointing toward a deer path that wound upward into the dense pines. They had to move now, while the intruders were focused on the house. Each step away from the building felt like a small victory, but Esla knew they couldn't run forever. Not in her condition, not in this terrain. The path was treacherous in the darkness, roots and rocks threatening to send her tumbling with every step. Marcus stayed close, steadying her when she stumbled, but she could feel him glancing back toward the house with increasing frequency. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached a small clearing where an old hunting blind sat forgotten among the trees. Marcus helped her inside the weathered structure, and they huddled together in the musty darkness. "Who were they?" Esla whispered, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The same people who've been hunting for your grandmother's secret all these years." Marcus's voice was tight with worry. "The ones who killed her." The words hit Esla like a physical blow. She'd suspected it, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her grandmother's fate real in a way it hadn't been before. "How do you know?" "Because I've been running from them for 3 years. Esla stared at him in the darkness, pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she'd been solving suddenly clicking into place. "You're not just some drifter who happened to show up, are you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Below them, flashlight beams moved like fireflies around the house, the searchers growing more frustrated with each empty room they discovered. "Your grandmother contacted me 6 months before she died," he finally said. "She knew they were getting close, knew she was running out of time. She hired me to watch over the house, to protect whatever she'd hidden there until someone from the family came to claim it. But you didn't know about me." "No, she died before she could tell me about any relatives. When you showed up, I thought you were just another treasure hunter at first. By the time I realized who you were," he shrugged helplessly, "I was already in too deep to walk away." A baby kicked sharply against Esla's ribs and she winced. The stress was getting to both of them. "So what now? We can't hide up here forever, and they're not going to give up." Marcus pulled out his phone. The screen's glow harsh in the confined space. No signal. "But there's an old fire road about a mile north of here. If we can reach it, flag down a ranger or Forest Service vehicle." The sound of engines starting echoed up from the valley below. Esla peered through a gap in the blind's walls and saw the headlights moving, not away from the property, but spreading out in a search pattern. "They're not leaving," she said, her voice hollow with realization. "They're hunting us." The mountain air felt different as Esla stepped out of the cabin the next morning, heavy with the promise of snow and something else, a tension that made her skin crawl. She pulled her jacket tighter around her growing belly and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved except the wind through pine boughs, but the feeling persisted. Inside, Marcus was already awake, hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and she wondered if he'd slept at all. "Any luck with the research?" she asked, pouring herself tea with hands that trembled slightly. "Some." He turned the screen toward her. "I found a reference to your grandmother's maiden name in a 1952 newspaper article. She was questioned in connection with a bank robbery in Denver, but never charged." Esla's cup stopped halfway to her lips. Gran? A bank robbery? Gets better. The money from that robbery was never recovered. $300,000, worth about $3 million today. The tea turned bitter in her mouth. You think that's what's hidden here? It would explain why people are still looking for it after all these years. Marcus closed the laptop and stood, wincing as his injured shoulder protested. The question is, how much do they know about what you found? Before Esla could answer, the sound of an engine cut through the morning quiet. They both froze, listening as it grew closer. A truck moving slowly up the mountain road. Expecting anyone? Marcus asked, already moving toward the window. Esla shook her head, following him. Through the glass, she could see a black pickup truck emerging from the trees. It wasn't speeding or trying to hide, just driving with deliberate purpose that somehow felt more threatening than any aggressive approach. Back door, Marcus said quietly. Now. They moved through the house as the truck's engine died. Esla grabbed the bag containing the gold coins and documents, while Marcus checked the revolver he'd taken from their previous attackers. The weight of it in his hand looked wrong, like he was playing a role he'd never auditioned for. The kitchen door opened silently, and they slipped out into the cold morning air. Esla's breath came in short puffs as they crept around the house's perimeter, using the thick pine trees for cover. Her pregnancy made moving quietly a challenge, but adrenaline sharpened her focus. From their hidden position, she could see two men approaching the front door. One was tall and lean, wearing an expensive wool coat that seemed out of place in the wilderness. The other was shorter, stockier, with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested military training. The tall man knocked politely. When no one answered, he nodded to his companion, who produced a set of lockpicks. They're not here to trash the place, Esla whispered. They're professionals. Marcus's jaw tightened, which means they probably know exactly what they're looking for. The men disappeared inside, and Marcus tugged Esla deeper into the trees. They had maybe 10 minutes before the search revealed their absence, maybe less if these men were as thorough as they appeared. The truck, Marcus said. We disable it, then circle back to get our car. They moved through the forest with painful care. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot to Esla's ears, and she found herself holding her breath until her lungs burned. The baby kicked, as if sensing her stress, and she pressed a hand to her belly in a futile gesture of protection. Marcus reached the truck first. Dropping to his knees beside the front wheel, he used his knife to slash the valve stem, releasing air with a soft hiss. He was moving to the rear tire when the cabin's front door slammed open. They're gone, the tall man called to his partner. Check the back. Esla's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Marcus freeze beside the truck. The stocky man would round the cabin's corner any second, and from there he'd have a clear view of the vehicle. There was nowhere to hide. Making a split-second decision, Esla stepped out from behind her tree. Looking for someone? She called out, drawing both men's attention to her position 50 yards away. The tall man's head snapped toward her voice, and she saw him reach inside his coat. But the distraction worked. Marcus finished with the tire and rolled under the truck, disappearing from view just as the second man appeared. Mrs. Chen, the tall man said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. We just want to talk. Funny way of showing it, Esla replied, backing toward the thicker trees. Breaking into my house and all. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Property taxes suggest otherwise. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Your grandmother was a clever woman, kept secrets for a very long time. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when the wrong people start digging. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Esla realized with crystal clarity that whatever game she'd stumbled into was far more dangerous than she'd imagined. The wind howled through the broken windows as Esla pressed herself against the stone foundation, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her terror. She could hear footsteps above, heavy boots crossing the wooden floor of her grandmother's house. They were inside. Marcus's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers cold but steady. They had made it to the old root cellar just as the headlights swept across the property. but now they were trapped 20 feet below ground with nowhere to run. The narrow tunnel that connected to the main cellar was their only escape route, and it led directly into the house where armed men were searching room by room. "How many did you see?" Marcus whispered, his breath barely audible. "3, maybe 4. Esla shifted uncomfortably on the damp earth floor. The leather satchel containing the documents felt impossibly heavy in her lap. Such small pieces of paper to have caused so much death and destruction. They had rifles. Above them, something crashed to the floor. Esla flinched, recognizing the sound of her grandmother's china cabinet being overturned. These weren't careful searchers. They were tearing the place apart with methodical violence. Marcus pulled out his phone, the screen's glow revealing the worry etched deep in his face. No signal. They were completely cut off from help, surrounded by mountains and men who had killed for far less than what Esla now possessed. "We can't stay here," he said, studying the tunnel entrance. "If they find that hidden panel upstairs, they'll discover this whole network." Esla knew he was right. Her grandmother had shown her these passages once when she was 12, spinning tales of bootleggers and hidden treasures that had seemed like fairy stories at the time. Now those childhood adventures might be the only thing keeping her baby alive. The footsteps moved closer, directly overhead now. A voice barked orders in a language Esla didn't recognize, followed by the sound of wood splintering. They were ripping apart the floorboards, looking for any hidden compartments. "The back tunnel," Esla whispered, remembering. "There's another way out near the old well. It comes up behind the woodshed." Marcus nodded grimly. "How long since you've been down there?" 20 years, maybe more. The admission hung between them like a death sentence. The passage could have collapsed, flooded, or been sealed off entirely, but it was their only chance. They crawled forward through the narrow opening, the damp stone walls pressing close on either side. Esla's pregnant belly made the passage even tighter, and she had to fight back waves of claustrophobia as the tunnel seemed to shrink around them. The musty air grew thicker with each breath. Behind them, the sounds of destruction grew louder. Esla heard the distinctive crack of the wooden panel giving way, followed by excited shouts. They had found the main cellar entrance. "Move faster," Marcus urged, his voice tight with urgency. The tunnel branched ahead, disappearing into absolute darkness in 3 different directions. Esla closed her eyes, trying to remember her grandmother's voice from all those years ago. Left led to the old smokehouse, but that had been torn down decades ago. Straight ahead went to the barn, but the men would see them crossing the open ground. Right curved toward the well and the woodshed, offering the most cover. This way. She turned right, praying her memory was accurate. The passage sloped downward, and soon they were splashing through ankle-deep water that seeped from the mountain springs. Esla's shoes squelched with each step, the sound echoing off the stone walls despite their efforts to move quietly. The baby kicked harder, protesting the cold and stress. A new sound reached them from behind, the scrape of boots against stone. The men had found the tunnels. Marcus grabbed Esla's arm, pulling her forward with desperate urgency. The water was deeper now, nearly to their knees, and the tunnel curved sharply upward. Esla's lungs burned. As she struggled to keep pace, her body already pushed beyond its limits. Then, impossibly, she saw it, a faint square of grey light ahead. The exit. They burst from the tunnel opening behind the collapsed woodshed, gasping the sharp mountain air. The house blazed with lights, every window illuminated as the searchers worked. At least 5 vehicles surrounded the property now, blocking every road. "The forest," Marcus said, pointing toward the dark tree line 50 yards away. "We can circle around to the old logging road." Esla nodded, though she wasn't sure her body could handle much more. The baby felt heavier than ever, and sharp pains shot through her back with each movement. But the alternative was unthinkable. They ran across the open ground, exposed and vulnerable, as shouts erupted from the house behind them. Someone had discovered the tunnel exit. Flashlight beams swept across the yard, searching. The forest welcomed them into its shadows, just as the first gunshot shattered the night. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house as Esla pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the root cellar. Above her, heavy footsteps moved with purpose across the kitchen floor. Marcus had found them. "I know you're here, Esla." His voice drifted down through the floorboards, calm and patient, the car still warm, fresh tire tracks in the mud. "You can't have gone far." Beside her in the darkness, Thomas gripped the leather satchel containing the remaining documents, the ones that proved Marcus had been embezzling from the Historical Society for years, using his position to fund his search for her grandmother's fortune, the ones that could destroy him if they ever saw daylight. Esla's hand instinctively moved to her belly, feeling the subtle curve that had grown more pronounced in recent weeks. The baby seemed to sense her fear, shifting restlessly inside her. She had to get out of here, had to protect what mattered most. "The Foundation records were very illuminating," Marcus continued, his footsteps moving methodically from room to room above them. "Your grandmother was cleverer than I gave her credit for, hiding those bonds in plain sight all these years, disguised as worthless family documents." Thomas leaned close to Esla's ear, his whisper barely audible. "There's another way out. Through the old mine shaft. It connects to the cellar through that passage behind the wine racks." Esla's blood ran cold. She'd avoided that part of the cellar, the section where the wooden shelving seemed to disappear into deeper shadows. The thought of crawling through some abandoned tunnel made her skin crawl, but the alternative, facing Marcus directly, was far worse. A crash from above made them both freeze. Marcus was getting frustrated, probably overturning furniture in his search. How long before he remembered the cellar? They moved carefully through the darkness, Thomas leading the way with his phone's flashlight dimmed to barely a glow. The wine racks were older than the rest of the cellar, hewn from rough timber that splintered under their touch. Behind the last rack, just as Thomas had promised, was a narrow opening in the stone wall. "This leads to the old silver mine," Thomas whispered. "Your great-grandfather used it during Prohibition. It comes out about a quarter-mile down the mountain near the creek." The opening was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Esla's claustrophobia kicked in immediately, but the sound of footsteps on the cellar stairs above them made the decision for her. Thomas went first, pulling the satchel behind him, and Esla followed, trying not to think about the weight of rock and earth above her head. The tunnel was worse than she'd imagined. The walls pressed close on either side, and the air tasted of minerals and decay. Her knees scraped against rough stone as she crawled forward, following the dim glow of Thomas's phone. Behind them, she heard Marcus's voice grow louder as he reached the cellar. "Clever girl," his voice echoed strangely in the confined space. He'd found the passage, but not clever enough. Panic drove Esla forward faster than was safe. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, and her breathing became labored. The baby pressed against her diaphragm, making each breath a struggle. Just when she thought she couldn't go another foot, cool air touched her face. Thomas was already standing in weak daylight, reaching back to help her out. They emerged behind a screen of overgrown bushes beside a narrow creek. The sound of running water would mask their movement, but it would also hide Marcus's approach. "We need to reach the main road," Thomas said, orienting himself. "There's a ranger station about 2 miles south." But as they prepared to move, Esla heard something that made her stomach drop. The distant sound of an engine, not from the direction of the house, but from the road below. Marcus hadn't come alone. He's been planning this, she realized. This whole thing. He knew about the tunnel. He's been studying this place for years. Thomas pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal. They were truly isolated now, caught between Marcus behind them and his accomplices blocking their escape route ahead. The sound of someone moving through the tunnel reached them, a rhythmic scraping that was getting closer. Marcus was coming, and he was moving fast. "This way," Thomas whispered, leading her along the creek bed. The water was shallow but ice-cold, soaking through their shoes within steps. Esla bit back a gasp as the shock of it hit her, but the sound of the current would hide their movement. They had maybe a 5-minute head start before Marcus emerged from the tunnel. 5 minutes to find safety, to protect the evidence that could end this nightmare, and to keep her unborn child safe from a man who had already killed once and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. As they stumbled through the rushing water, Esla couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into Marcus's trap. The abandoned mining shaft yawned before them like a mouth frozen in an eternal scream. Marcus gripped his flashlight tighter, the beam cutting through the dusty air that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Behind him, Esla's breathing came in short, careful bursts, the baby making everything harder, even something as simple as walking down a treacherous slope. "The entrance should be about 50 yards in," she whispered, consulting the map they'd found in her grandmother's final hiding spot. "According to this, there's a secondary chamber that branches off to the left." The walls pressed closer as they descended, rough-hewn stone that wept moisture and decades of accumulated grime. Their footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing back at them from unseen depths. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, not one set by the men hunting them, but by time itself. "Wait." Esla stopped so suddenly that Marcus nearly collided with her. She pressed one hand against the wall, the other against her stomach. "Do you hear that?" Marcus held his breath and listened. At first, nothing but the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Then he caught it, a faint scraping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Someone else was in the mine. They extinguished their flashlights and pressed themselves against the wall. The darkness was absolute, so complete that Esla couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The scraping grew louder, accompanied now by the shuffle of footsteps and the occasional muttered curse. A light appeared around the bend ahead, weak and wavering, like a dying phone battery. Marcus counted at least 2 distinct voices, maybe 3. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable, frustration edged with desperation. "Been searching for hours. If that old woman was lying, she wasn't lying. Victor doesn't make mistakes about these things." The names meant nothing to Esla, but the cold certainty in the second voice made her blood freeze. These weren't opportunistic treasure hunters. They were professionals, and they'd been at this long enough to develop sources, methods, contacts. People who knew things about her grandmother that she was only beginning to understand. The lights moved away from them, deeper into the mine. Marcus waited until the voices faded before clicking his flashlight back on, keeping it pointed at the ground. They needed to move fast now. If these people found the cache first, everything her grandmother had died protecting would be lost. The secondary chamber appeared exactly where the map indicated, a narrow opening that would have been easy to miss if they hadn't known what to look for. Marcus squeezed through first, then helped guide Esla through the gap. Her pregnancy made every movement awkward, but she pushed through with a determination that reminded him exactly whose granddaughter she was. The chamber beyond was smaller than expected, barely large enough for both of them to stand upright. Marcus swept his light across the walls, looking for any sign of disturbance, any indication that something had been hidden here. "There," Esla breathed, pointing to a section of wall where the stones didn't quite match the rest. "Those rocks are different. Newer." They worked together to remove the carefully placed stones, Esla directing while Marcus did the heavy lifting. Behind the makeshift wall, wrapped in oiled canvas and sealed in metal containers that had somehow survived decades of moisture and neglect. They found it. The documents were in multiple languages, some in scripts Esla couldn't even identify. But the photographs were universal in their clarity, images of artwork that belonged in museums, jewelry that belonged to families long since scattered by war, and page after page of bank account numbers, safe deposit box locations, and names that had been reported dead for 70 years. "My God," Marcus whispered, holding up a photograph of a painting he recognized from art history textbooks. "This piece alone is worth millions, and it's supposed to be lost." Esla was studying a different document, a list of names and locations written in her grandmother's careful handwriting. Some entries were crossed out, others marked with dates that spanned decades. It was a record of restitution, she realized. Her grandmother hadn't just been hiding stolen treasure, she'd been slowly, carefully returning it to its rightful owners. The voices were getting closer again, echoing through the main tunnel with renewed urgency. Someone had found something or noticed their disturbed footprints in the dust. "We need to go," Marcus said, already stuffing documents back into their containers. "Now." But as they prepared to leave their hiding spot, Esla noticed something else, a final envelope, separate from the rest, with her name written across it in her grandmother's unmistakable script. Inside was a single photograph, her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a man Esla didn't recognize, both of them wearing resistance armbands and holding rifles. On the back, in fading ink, "Some secrets die with us, others live on through love. Choose wisely, my darling girl." The footsteps were almost upon them now. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as Esla pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the root cellar. Above her, footsteps creaked across the floorboards of her grandmother's house, heavy, deliberate steps that told her Marcus had brought reinforcements. She clutched the leather satchel containing the most valuable documents from her grandmother's hidden cache. The rest of the fortune, the bonds, the rare coins, the jewelry that had funded decades of her grandmother's quiet resistance work, remained concealed behind the false wall she'd discovered 3 days ago. But these papers in her hands were different. These could destroy lives, topple governments, rewrite history books. The baby kicked sharply against her ribs as if sensing her fear. Esla placed a protective hand over her swollen belly and tried to steady her breathing. The narrow tunnel her grandmother had carved between the cellar and the old mine shaft was her only escape route, but crawling through it in her condition would be nearly impossible. A beam of flashlight swept across the cellar stairs, and Esla shrank deeper into the shadows. She'd been careful to replace the wooden planks over the entrance when she'd climbed down, but Marcus was thorough. He'd eventually find her. "I know you're down there, Esla." His voice drifted through the floorboards, calm and patient. "Your car's still here, and there's nowhere else to run. Not in this storm." Another set of footsteps joined Marcus above, lighter but equally purposeful. A woman's voice speaking in rapid German. Esla caught fragments, something about time running out, about others coming. Her blood chilled as she realized Marcus wasn't the only one hunting her grandmother's secrets. The planks above her head groaned, and dust filtered down as someone began systematically searching the house. They were methodical, professional. Whatever protection she'd imagined her isolation might provide evaporated as she understood the scope of what she'd stumbled into. Her phone buzzed silently in her pocket, a text from Detective Chen, the one person who'd believed her story about Marcus. "Units en route. Stay hidden." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by fresh terror. If law enforcement was coming, it meant Marcus and his associates would become desperate. The cellar door rattled above her head, testing the lock. Esla forced herself to move, crawling toward the tunnel entrance she'd discovered behind a rack of her grandmother's preserved vegetables. The opening was barely wide enough for her shoulders, lined with rough stone that would tear her clothes and skin, but it was her only chance. As she squeezed into the narrow passage, she heard the cellar door splinter open above. Flashlight beams swept across the space she'd just vacated, and angry voices echoed off the stone walls. The tunnel stretched ahead of her, black and suffocating, but she pushed forward on her hands and knees, the satchel clutched against her chest. Behind her, she heard them discovering the false wall where the rest of the treasure was hidden. The sound of wood splintering, metals scraping against stone, and then excited voices as they found her grandmother's decades-old secret. Let them take it, she thought. The real power was in the papers she carried, evidence that could finally bring justice for crimes committed before she was born. The tunnel seemed endless, each movement a struggle as her pregnancy made crawling almost impossible. Her hands were scraped raw, her knees bleeding through her jeans, but she forced herself forward. The baby had gone still, and she tried not to think about the stress she was putting on both of them. Finally, blessedly, She felt cool air on her face. The tunnel opened into the old mine shaft her grandmother had shown her as a child, warning her never to play there. Now she understood why her grandmother had really known about this place. It had been her escape route, her insurance policy against the very people who now ransacked her house. Esla pulled herself out of the tunnel just as the storm's fury reached its peak. Rain lashed through the partially collapsed mine entrance, but she could see lights moving on the mountain road below, emergency vehicles climbing toward the house. Chen had kept his word. She pressed herself against the mine wall and opened the satchel, using her phone's flashlight to examine the documents one more time. Bank routing numbers, names of corporations that still existed today, photographs of men in suits shaking hands with Nazi officials. Her grandmother had been more than a refugee. She'd been a spy, a guardian of secrets that could still topple empires. The sound of sirens grew closer, mixing with the storm's howl. Esla closed the satchel and prepared to descend the treacherous slope. The hardest part was just beginning. The safe house felt more like a prison with each passing hour. Esla paced the small living room, her hand pressed against her growing belly, feeling the baby's restless movements that seemed to mirror her own anxiety. Through the grimy windows, she could see Agent Martinez speaking urgently into his phone on the front porch, his face etched with concern. Detective Chen emerged from the kitchen, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee for me, herbal tea for you," she said, offering Esla the cup. "Any word from Martinez? He's been out there for 20 minutes, Esla replied, accepting the tea gratefully. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Before Chen could answer, Martinez burst through the door, his usual calm demeanor shattered. "We need to move. Now." What happened? Chen was already reaching for her weapon. "Kozlov's men hit the evidence facility an hour ago. They took everything, the documents, the gold samples, all of it." Martinez ran his hands through his hair. "But that's not the worst part. They had inside information. Someone told them exactly where everything was stored." Esla's blood ran cold. "You think there's a leak in your department?" "I don't think it, I know it. The only people who knew the exact location were myself, Chen, and 2 other agents. One of them just stopped answering his phone." The weight of betrayal settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Esla sank onto the couch, her mind racing. "So what does this mean? Are we safe here?" Martinez's expression was grim. "This location was compartmentalized, but I can't guarantee anything anymore. We need to assume they're coming." As if summoned by his words, the sound of gravel crunching under tires drifted through the windows. All 3 froze, listening. The engine cut off, followed by the soft thud of car doors closing. "How many vehicles came in?" Chen whispered, moving toward the window. Martinez was already checking his weapon. "We only have 1 access road. If that's them, we're trapped." Esla struggled to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her despite her pregnancy. "There's another way out. The back of the house borders national forest. There's a trail that leads down to the highway about 2 miles south. Can you make that hike in your condition?" Chen asked. "I don't have much choice, do I?" A sharp knock echoed through the house, followed by a voice that made Esla's skin crawl. "Miss Thorson, this is Agent William Hayes, FBI. We're here to escort you to a more secure location." Martinez's face went pale. Hayes is the agent who stopped answering his phone. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Miss Thorson, we know you're in there. We're here to help." "Back door," Martinez mouthed silently, gesturing toward the rear of the house. They moved quickly but quietly, gathering only essential items. Esla grabbed the small bag she'd been keeping packed since this nightmare began, her grandmother's journal tucked safely inside. The baby kicked as if sensing the danger, and she pressed her hand against her belly in a futile gesture of protection. The back door opened with a soft creak that sounded deafening in the tense silence. Martinez peered out first, scanning the tree line for any movement. "Clear," he whispered. They slipped out into the fading daylight, the autumn air crisp against their faces. Behind them, the knocking had stopped, replaced by more ominous sounds. The splintering of wood as the front door was forced open. "Move," Chen urged, pushing Esla gently toward the forest trail. The path was narrow and overgrown, barely visible in the gathering dusk. Esla's pregnancy made her movements awkward, but fear drove her forward. Branches caught at her clothes and roots threatened to trip her, but she pressed on, guided by Martinez's flashlight beam. Behind them, shouts erupted from the safe house. "They're not here! Check the back!" "Faster," Martinez urged, though Esla was already pushing herself to her limits. The trail wound through dense undergrowth, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Esla's breathing became labored, each step requiring enormous effort. The baby seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly within her. "I need to rest," she gasped, leaning against a large pine tree. Chen checked her watch. "We've been moving for 30 minutes. The highway should be close." "Listen," Martinez said, tilting his head. In the distance, the faint hum of traffic drifted through the trees. Just then, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness behind them, sweeping back and forth across the trail they'd just traveled. "There, I see movement." The voice was close, too close. Esla forced herself to move again, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. The baby's life depended on it. Her life depended on it. The truth about her grandmother's legacy, about everything that had happened, would die with her if they were caught. The highway's glow appeared through the trees ahead, promising salvation if they could just reach it in time. The sirens grew louder as Esla pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the cellar, her heart hammering against her ribs. Above them, footsteps thundered across the wooden floors, Marcus's men searching room by room. She could hear their frustrated shouts, the crash of furniture being overturned. "They're getting closer," Detective Rivera whispered, adjusting his grip on his service weapon. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on his shoulder, where Marcus's bullet had grazed him during their escape from the main floor. Esla's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby had been unusually active since the chaos began. As if sensing her fear, the little one gave a particularly strong kick that made her wince. She thought of her grandmother's letter, still tucked in her jacket pocket, the final piece of the puzzle that had led them to this moment. "The real treasure isn't the gold, my darling girl, it's the proof." The documents they'd found hidden behind the false wall weren't just grandmother's personal papers. They were evidence of a decades-long conspiracy involving the Brennan Mining Company, forged safety reports, and the deliberate cave-in that had killed 17 miners in 1962. Marcus Brennan's father hadn't just covered up the accident, he'd caused it to hide the theft of gold ore worth millions in today's market. "There," Marcus's voice boomed from directly overhead. "Check the cellar, they have to be down there." Rivera motioned for silence as they heard the cellar door creak open. Footsteps descended the wooden stairs, each creak echoing through the stone chamber like a countdown. Esla squeezed her eyes shut, trying to control her ragged breathing. The beam of a flashlight swept across the far wall, then moved methodically toward their hiding spot behind the old coal furnace. In seconds, they would be discovered. Rivera raised his weapon, his jaw set with grim determination, but the flashlight stopped moving. Instead, they heard a different sound, police radios crackling with static, growing closer. "Boss, we've got company," someone shouted from upstairs. "State police, FBI, the whole cavalry's coming up the mountain road." Marcus cursed loudly. "How did they—" His voice cut off abruptly, and Esla heard rapid footsteps retreating up the stairs. Rivera had managed to get a message out before the cell towers were jammed. Help was coming. The next few minutes passed in a blur of shouting, running footsteps, and finally, the distant pop of gunfire. Esla found herself thinking about her grandmother as a young woman, discovering the same terrible truth but lacking the means to expose it. How long had she carried this burden alone? When the cellar finally fell silent, Rivera called out cautiously, "Federal agents, we're down here!" The response came immediately. "Detective Rivera, Agent Foster, FBI, are you secure?" They emerged from their hiding place to find the house swarming with law enforcement. Agent Foster, a stern woman with graying hair, helped Esla up the stairs while EMTs attended to Rivera's wound. "Marcus Brennan?" Rivera asked. "In custody, along with 3 associates," Foster replied, "though he's claiming this is all a misunderstanding, that you broke into his property." Esla pulled the packet of documents from her jacket. "These should clear that up." Foster's eyes widened as she scanned the papers. "These are—" She looked up at Esla with something approaching awe. "Do you understand what you've uncovered here? My grandmother spent 40 years trying to expose the truth about what happened to her father and the other minors," Esla said quietly. "She just didn't know how to do it safely. Well, she raised quite a granddaughter." Foster carefully sealed the documents in an evidence bag. "These will put the Brennan family away for a very long time. The statute of limitations might have run out on some charges, but conspiracy, murder, fraud, Marcus won't see freedom again." As they prepared to leave the mountain house, Esla took one last look around. The place that had seemed like such a burden just weeks ago now felt different. Her grandmother's spirit seemed to whisper through the rooms, finally at peace. "What about the gold?" Rivera asked, his arm in a fresh sling. Esla smiled, remembering the final line of her grandmother's letter. Grandmother wrote that the real treasure was justice for the families who lost everything. The gold was just what it took to get someone's attention. She paused in the doorway, one hand on her belly where new life grew strong and determined. Her child would know the truth about their family's courage, about a woman who had refused to let evil triumph even when it cost her everything. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and possibility as they descended toward the waiting vehicles, toward a future finally free from the shadows of the past. The first rays of dawn painted the mountain peaks gold as Esla sat on the porch steps, cradling her coffee mug against her rounded belly. 3 months had passed since Marcus Thorne's arrest, and the mountain house no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like home. The sound of gravel crunching announced Detective Chen's arrival. She'd become a regular visitor, checking in as the legal proceedings wound their way through the system. Esla had grown to appreciate the woman's steady presence and dry humor. "How are you feeling?" Chen asked, settling beside her on the steps. "Like I'm carrying a tiny acrobat," Esla smiled, feeling the baby's familiar kicks. "But good, really good." Chen nodded toward the house, where the sounds of renovation work echoed from within. "The contractors are making progress. Finally. The foundation's solid now, and we've restored most of the structural damage." Esla paused. "It's funny. I spent so much time focused on what was hidden that I nearly missed what was right in front of me. Your grandmother's real legacy." "Exactly." Esla gestured toward the garden, where new plantings were beginning to take root alongside her grandmother's carefully tended roses. "She didn't just leave me money, she left me a place to build something lasting." A car appeared on the winding road below, David's sedan navigating the improved driveway they'd installed last month. He'd been commuting back and forth from the city, gradually transitioning his practice to handle more remote consultations. The mountain isolation that had once terrified Esla now felt like a gift. "Any word on Thorne's associates?" Esla asked, as David parked and began unloading groceries. "The last of them were arrested in Prague 2 weeks ago." "It's over, Esla. The network is dismantled." Chen's expression grew serious. "There's something else, though. We found additional documents in one of Thorne's safe houses. Your grandmother wasn't just hiding money, she was protecting information. Names, dates, evidence of war crimes that would have put innocent people at risk if it had fallen into the wrong hands." The revelation settled over Esla like a familiar blanket. It made perfect sense. Her grandmother had always been a protector, someone who understood the weight of secrets and the responsibility they carried. David approached, balancing bags of groceries and a bouquet of wildflowers. "Morning, Detective." "Esla," the doctor's office called. "They want to move your appointment to Thursday." "Fine by me." Esla accepted his kiss and the flowers with equal warmth. "Chen was just telling me about grandmother's other secret." "The documents?" David set down the groceries and stretched his back. I can't say I'm surprised. She had that quality, like she was carrying the weight of other people's stories. Stories she never told, Esla mused. Maybe that's why she left everything to me. She knew I'd understand the importance of protecting people. Chen stood, brushing dust from her jeans. Speaking of which, have you decided what you're doing with the money? Esla exchanged glances with David. They'd been discussing this for weeks, weighing options and possibilities. We're starting a foundation. Support for displaced families, people who need a fresh start. David's handling the legal framework. And we're keeping enough for the baby's future, David added quickly, and to maintain this place. But the rest, it should do some good in the world. Your grandmother would approve, Chen said. She always believed in second chances. As the detective's car disappeared around the bend, Esla and David sat together in comfortable silence. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and the promise of snow in the higher elevations. Soon winter would arrive, and they'd experience their first full season in the house together. Are you nervous? David asked, his hand finding hers. About the baby? The foundation? Winter? Esla laughed. All of it, honestly, but it's a good nervous, like standing at the edge of something wonderful. Inside the house, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, who'd finally visited last month and grudgingly admitted the place had potential. The message included a photo of baby clothes and a string of heart emojis that would have seemed impossible just months ago. My mother wants to come for Thanksgiving, Esla announced. All of them? All of them. Aunts, uncles, the works. She says the baby should know their family. David groaned theatrically. We'll need more bedrooms. Good thing we have an entire second floor to renovate. Esla stood, brushing off her jeans. Come on, let's go see what the contractors have uncovered now. As they walked toward the house, Esla felt the baby shift and settle, as if responding to the rhythm of their steps. The mountains stretched around them, vast and protective, holding space for whatever came next. She'd found more than treasure in these hills. She'd found her foundation, her future, her home. The house welcomed them back with the sounds of progress and possibility, its walls finally ready to hold new secrets, laughter, family dinners, a child's first steps. The best kind of secrets, the ones built from love.